In a recent video, I went over the energy system in Star Wars Empire at War, talking about how it works and how it doesn't. There were a few comments asking about whether energy is how stuns from ion cannons work, whether the planetary type of ion cannon or otherwise, like in mods which make any ion cannon projectile apply a type of stun. I even saw some people insisting that this is how it works off of energy, and at first glance you'd think so. It makes sense, right? A ship with no energy is stunned, so if a projectile can eventually wear a ship down to zero energy, that's when a stun would happen. The actual answer, though, is that no, these are actually two, sometimes three different systems. Losing energy doesn't actually apply an effect at all other than making the shield stop recharging in most situations. Remember, like we covered in the last video, a unit's weapons will only slow down firing with a loss of energy if they are not based on hardpoints. So that'd be only a single built-in weapon per unit, which almost never exists in space combat anyways. So today, we're going to take a look at how all of these different systems interact, how they overlap, and how there's actually two different ways that stuns are actually applying, neither of which has anything to do with energy. First, let's take a look at the planetary ion cannon in the base game, which does apply a stun. While it does do energy damage, you'll notice there's two other blocks of code directly relating to stuns. The energy damage here would be enough to prevent the shield from recharging briefly, but in the base game, the Star Destroyer also only has an energy pool of 10 and a refresh rate of 5, so the impact there is pretty minimal. No matter what those numbers are though, it would still be fairly minimal. We have a second block here, which says to disable the engines on that projectile hitting a ship if there's no energy left on the ship, which theoretically can contribute to the stun effect. But while that brings in at least a slight tie to energy, it's not a direct effect of running out of energy. But more importantly, it's not actually what's causing the ship to stop moving from this projectile. For that, we have to look at this next block of code, the actual ion stun. So I've moved over to Thrawn's Revenge again, where we have our display set up, and we can take a look at how some of this works. You'll see here there's a flag which sets the stun to true, and then there's a line with how long the stun lasts, then the lines which show how much to slow down both the speed and the firing rate. And this is particularly important because, as we went over in the last video, hardpoints are again not impacted by energy. So it's these lines, not the lack of energy, which makes this Star Destroyer sit there, and even if enemies were actually in range, it still wouldn't fire after being hit by the ion cannon. It's not because of a lack of energy. If it had no energy but it didn't have this stun applied, this Star Destroyer would be firing normally. Even if I turn off that line telling the ship to stop if there's no energy, you can see the effect is the exact same. But now, if I leave the energy damage on, turn that line back on saying to disable the engines if the energy runs out when this projectile hits, and then I disable the quote-unquote real ion stun settings, if we test that, you'll see that other than the shields dropping from the initial damage, the ship isn't stunned in any meaningful sense. I personally can't even really see an effect from the line making it slow down if there's no energy, but I also didn't ramp those values up to test them enough. In this second test, it looks like it slows down, but that's also right as the ship has jumped in from hyperspace, so your mileage may vary on that. You could definitely test that a bit more. But as you can see, while intuitively it may seem like this is an outgrowth of the energy system, ion stuns are actually a wholly separate system. But now if I turn the energy damage off entirely and only have the ion stun, what we end up with is identical to when the energy damage is done. The entire stun is coming from this effect, not the energy. But that still isn't the end of it either. I mentioned there's a second way these kinds of stun effects can work, which is by liking this video and subscribing for more. No, that's definitely a stunning fact, but that doesn't sound right. Okay, right, here it is. So on top of this kind of binary stunned and not stunned setup directly within ion cannons, there's one more way we can actually apply effects with projectiles, called projectile combat modifiers. There are a few categories we can actually do with this, like reducing ship defenses when hit, or reducing unit speed when hit. The base game actually only uses this last example, I think, with the Zon Consortium's MAL slowing units when they're hit. It's the whole carbonite missile setup they have. That kind of unit speed reduction is one way to do an ion effect, but the other half of the real ion stun is reducing fire speed, which I think is generally the more noticeable one, and the one that people are probably going for that. So for this example, we'll set up the ion cannons with the fire speed reduction. These effects also show particles, so to make it especially obvious when it applies, I'll make it show the effect we use for world devastators. And again, to make it pretty obvious when things are firing and when the effect is applying, I'm going to make this happen with the octuple barbette turrets on an Imperial Star Destroyer rather than the ion cannons, since that should be a bit easier for us to track. This is a bit less extreme than the regular ion stun, so it's probably the better way to go for generic ion projectiles. Though note again, there is still no energy involved in this. This is its own separate thing. But here we go, lots of fun little particles flying up, so you can see that it's working, or I guess you can just look at the actual rate of fire slowing down, but that sounds tedious. The other thing to note though is that these mods only apply if you have a projectile with some kind of area of effect. So if you're trying to apply this yourself, make sure you add the blast area range line to the projectile from another kind of bomb type one, otherwise you won't get the projectile mods applying. But that also means if you set the range fairly high, it's something you could use for, say, a Chiss Connor net from the Outbound Flight books, hitting some fighters and stopping them in their tracks or something. That's going to do it for today's video though, getting even deeper into what energy does and doesn't do. If you've enjoyed, leave a like, subscribe, or let me know in the comments. All of those things really help the channel grow. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you next time.